Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us in the world today. And welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. In the episode today, we're diving into realist thematic analysis. Rather than just identifying patterns in data, realist thematic analysis asks, what mechanisms are at play here? It invites researchers to dig into generative causation and to keep context at the forefront. This approach is especially useful when working across dynamic systems or with diverse stakeholder perspectives, where traditional thematic analysis may fall short. Today, we'll explore how realist thematic analysis was developed, how it works in practice, and what it offers researchers looking to make sense of complexity. We're joined by someone who has been at the forefront of this work, designing, refining, and applying this method. And a very warm welcome to Gareth Wiltshire. Gareth, lovely to see you. How are you this morning?
Hi, Alejandro. How are you? Very good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
No worries at all. Thanks to you again. I mean, just before the call, we were talking about how useful I found your work in my own analysis as I've been doing realist work, and I'd love for listeners to hear more around the ideas I came across, some examples, and some thoughts around realist thematic analysis.
Mm.
Just before we dive into that, though, Gareth, would you be happy to just share a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work in realist so far?
Yeah, and so background to my involvement in realism and critical realism, I sometimes use those interchangeably, is that essentially encountered critical realism when, like most PhD students, are introduced to conversations about ontology and epistemology in the research methods training, and a lot of my training in qualitative research, proposed these two positions: positivism, which is essentially anything to do with numbers, the sort of was being characterized and oversimplified like that. And then these people who do interviews would be interpretivists and constructivists. But then looking into that a little bit more and reading a little bit more, it didn't make a huge amount of sense to me. So then I came across critical realism as a way of really bridging the two, and it seemed to make much more sense to me, at least. And actually, that kind of introduction is mirrored in the paper on thematic analysis, where we essentially say that there is a bit of a binary out there in people's minds about methodology, as well as a binary in how to do thematic analysis. So we essentially say that, well, maybe it's not a binary, and maybe there are ways of incorporating the good aspects of both of these approaches. So a kind of a both and rather than an either or approach to methods. So that was how I initially encountered it, and I've written about how it's helpful for interdisciplinarity, working with other disciplines, concepts about validity, paper about mixed methods. And then I'm also, as a sociologist, I'm also interested in the other scholarship in critical realism. So Margaret Archer's morphogenesis is something that I've used and thought about before, as well as Dave Eldevas's norm circles. Yeah, it's firstly I'm interested in methodology, but I'm also interested in the sociological work that comes from critical realism as well.
Fascinating. Thanks, Gareth. And I completely agree that those conversations that PhD students or researchers start having, and I think for PhD students, certainly it's a starting point, but even some researchers also within their career, they start shifting in their ways of thinking and their own, ontological and epistemological view, or as we call it, the lens, like the realist lens that we have here. So it's interesting to find your journey. And I know as well that, of course, working at Loughborough University and doing a lot of work within sport and physical activity. So, how does the realist lens help within that dynamic and complex system of sports? Just before we dive into the realist thematic analysis, because I feel that that's a really interesting area as well, particularly in the world of today.
Yeah, well, in a number of different ways. I'd say the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that my school is called the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences. And when you think about it, it's not necessarily an academic discipline in itself. It's not a school of sociology, the school of maths. It's really an applied field. That sport, exercise and health is where you apply other disciplines too. So what happens in schools like mine is that it's very interdisciplinary. I'll have colleagues who do biomechanics, exercise physiology, psychology, as well as politics, policy, sociology, and philosophy. So my colleagues are a mix of people, and sometimes you get people doing different methods, having different approaches, different tensions. For me, I see some people feeling like they have disagreements, but a lot of time they're talking past each other. We have a natural science and social science divide, and in Bhaskara's initial realist work, what I read was a lot of breaking down that social and natural science binary and thinking of phenomena as actually being, well, there are generative mechanisms, there are causal things in the world that are social, and also there's things that are natural. And it makes sense to me that we should have a approach to doing science which encompasses both of them. So that's a kind of one of methodologically and in terms of how we're thinking about what's out there in the world. I think that in sport and exercise we need to think about social, psychological, and natural entities in combination.
Yeah, certainly, Gareth. I completely agree. And again, from my background as well in sport, I couldn't agree more. And from that perspective of, depends, even if it's elite athlete or community sport, whatever it is, and looking at the individual, the structure surrounding the individual, and X, Y, Z that can happen. So that is fascinating. Um, and of course, within your work in sport, but other areas, you then have been using this realist thematic analysis. And there is that paper that we're talking about that you developed with Nora Ronkainen, which I found so useful, aligning with realist principles and going through this process of experiential and inferential and dispositional themes, which we will explain what those mean in a sec. But just before we get started into the mechanics of that, would you be happy to share what motivated you to create this approach in the first place? What gaps were there, or what needs and were you hoping to address?
I think, the motivation is, well, we actually wrote it in the time of around COVID. So motivation was just to keep ourselves busy and give ourselves something to do. But of course, it was the paper that came after a period of a couple of years, really, working with Nora and some other colleagues about how to apply critical realism, how to apply these ideas in realism. And one of the essential component of doing a piece of qualitative research is the analysis. And we found that, okay, we had this approach, this little argument about ontology and epistemology that we'd really hashed out and published. We thought that has implications for, well, actually you can do qualitative and quantitative together, and here's how you make sense of it. And we thought, well, actually you also can use concepts like validity in a different way. But so this was the next step. This was, how do we deal with analysis? And in the realist literature, there's been a really thorough, deep philosophical work on methodology, and there's been some deep social theorizing as well. And then in terms of the methodology, I think the strongest and most mature and advanced work is really from the realist methods community. So realist analysis, realist evaluation, and realist synthesis in particular. So Pawson and Tilley and many others that have followed on. So, but there was still a real gap in people saying, how do you translate this abstract ideas into the practical doing of research? So, fantastic papers by Amber Fletcher and Ferdy McCumbang, who I know you know as well, on interviewing. They were papers that we thought, okay, this is now what we can borrow some of these ideas and build on the work of a group of scholars actually trying to put this to use. But we didn't see anything in analysis really, and we thought, well, I spend most of my time and most of my colleagues are qualitative researchers, and lots of qualitative researchers do thematic analysis as the first option, the first point of call. Obviously, Brown and Clark's thematic analysis is the most popular and has become the standard expectation for people to use. So we thought, well, let's take that. Let's focus on analysis. Let's take thematic analysis of interview data. Let's look at thematic analysis as it's presented by Brown and Clark. And they've been really prolific in the last few years as well. They've obviously had their 2006 paper, which is incredibly widely cited. Over 100,000 citations, I'm sure, at the moment on Google Scholar. But then also prolific in recent years as well. And what we've noticed from reading the work of these real leaders in qualitative methodology was a move towards more of this qualitative paradigm, as they called it. And they've also called it a big Q qualitative, which differentiates some people who are doing interviews, but not in a way that's grounded in a qualitative paradigm, as they call it, with people who are working with interview data, but in a more sort of quantitative way, or a more neo-positivist way, as they call it. But as I mentioned in the introduction, what we saw when reading this was this binary being set up again in Brown and Clark's thinking and framing of their version of analysis. There was this split, this binary between their version is and what the neo-positivist version of thematic analysis is. So immediately then that gap is sort of shouting out at us from the page. Anyone who's read critical realism and realist stuff more generally looks at this and sees, no, I think there's actually another way of looking at this. So I guess that's part of the motivation. Let's try and work with this. Let's try and see if there's another way of thinking of it. And then, we started having some conversations. One thing led to another. You feel like you're onto something. You feel like it's starting to form in your head. And then several months later, you realise that in lots of confused conversations, you come out the other end with something which feels a lot more structured.
That is brilliant, Gareth. And I love always asking this question because a lot of the time we read a paper, and there's only certain words or certain amount that you can explain all this background and all this thinking and ideas and justification that comes towards a publication or towards a piece of work. So it's so interesting to see that, and I completely concur with what you're saying. And there is, of course, a increased amount of papers in realist evaluation, realist synthesis, critical realism, just realist work more generally into these practicalities. But actually, one of the areas that you mentioned, analysis, is one that I think also a lot of early career researchers or PhD students tend to struggle a little bit with. How do you start analyzing realist work, and how do you go from this paper to this generative hidden mechanisms that exist? So thank you so much for sharing that little whistle stop tour of the story, and also very valid reason during COVID. That's something to do in that sense, but certainly something very valuable to do. You have these conversations, you go through realist thematic analysis, what it can look like, what it does, and then all of a sudden you come up with this idea of using experiential, inferential, and dispositional themes. Would you be happy to explain to listeners what those are and how those came about?
Yeah, so I think they're inspired by, but not perfectly mapped onto Bhaskara's stratified ontological conceptualization of what the world is made up of. And so for Bhaskara, you've got this empirical domain. So these are the things that happen in the world and are observed and observable. So yeah, empirically available. And he says, but that's not all we have. We need to remember that there's things that happen, events that happen, but they're not always noticed. It doesn't mean they're not there, but they're just not always noticed, and so they're not empirically observed. This is the actual domain. But then, interestingly, that there's and more in a more novel way in ontological thinking, there's also this real domain. There's this curious domain of possibilities, of mechanisms, of causal powers. They're not necessarily observable even, but they have the potential to produce events. So the fact that they actually cause things in the real world, you kind of have to infer that that they exist. So this was, I guess, the initial sort of framing. It doesn't map perfectly onto the thematic structure that we use, but it's I guess a core idea. So we said, well, when you're doing a normal thematic analysis, so let's say Brown and Clark's thematic analysis, what we noticed is, well, in other people's work and also when you're doing it yourself, kind of everything can be put into themes of the same kind of type. You're essentially trying to um, group themes in whatever way that makes sense to your mind, to help to start categorizing things into sort of shared patterns of meaning. But we actually thought it was more helpful to think, well, the things that are coming out in interviews are sometimes people's experiences, but sometimes people are talking about not their experiences concretely, that they're speculating about things, they're talking about other people's experiences. They're not, so in a way what comes through in the interview and the analysis is different types of things. So we thought maybe we should kind of structure the themes in a different way. We also think, well, what are interviews for? What's qualitative research for? What are its strengths, and what can you be most confident of in using this method of interviews and analyzing interviews. And we thought, well, really, the most solid foundation, the bread and butter of an interview is people being able to talk about their own experiences. That they're going to be able to, you want to come out of this research study being confident to report your findings and say, my participants feel this way. This is what they think. These are what they're concerned about. This is how they feel. So this was our starting point of what we thought was in the empirical domain. We can have really confident claims about what people are saying about themselves. So essentially then we said, well, this is the first stage of our thinking. We can come up with themes, but these themes are in this category of people saying really confident things about themselves. So we thought, well, let's kind of structure it a little bit grammatically, and try and think of a sentence where we're translating what they're saying into something like, this participant expresses that. This participant expresses that they are feeling overwhelmed today. Maybe they didn't use those words exactly, but then it's our job as a researcher to kind of clarify that in that framing, and essentially go through the interview transcript by doing that as many times as possible with as many different types of these experiences that we called experiential themes. So these can be concerns, feelings, thoughts, anything they can express primarily about themselves. And this is the experiential level, basically. But then we thought that that's not enough. We've been working really hard in the qualitative community for decades about what extra can you bring to it, because that's a kind of very basic surface level understanding. So we need to bring something else to it, and that means we need to get a little bit more depth. And this is probably the distinction you get from maybe undergrad, um, a study, an undergrad dissertation, or a plain English conversation, common sense conversation with lay people about what happened in the film you just watched, what happened in the podcast you just listened to, and you can report what was said, without much of a much debate or interpretation. So we realize that the next level is what you need in order to get a deeper understanding. So this deeper understanding of interpretation is what we call these inferential themes. So what can you infer from what people are saying? So this involves going beyond just stating what people have said and expressed into a kind of a conceptual redescription, and also inferring maybe from either the strength of what people were saying, or maybe, and people don't like to talk about this in qualitative research as much, but the amount of times that people said things, or if all of your participants said the same thing, that's important to be aware of compared to if only two people said this thing, or if all the men say this and all the women say that. It's also important to recognize that. So starting to move beyond those empirical themes, you then develop a next stage, which would be these inferential themes, where you're now moving on along a continuum of the amount of interpretation that you are doing. And we said, well, let's reframe all the experiential themes in a different way. Let's say data show that some participants in this study feel this, or something to that, or something like that. So it's plausible to claim that this happens. So that's kind of possible on the inferential themes. And then finally, I'm trying to just do this briefly. Obviously, this took 15 pages in the paper. So in the dispositional themes, then we said, look, there's another thing that comes up in other types of thematic analysis. This might be a whole theme in itself, but this is a way of just organizing your thoughts and saying, well, it's fair enough, it's a theme, but this is a particular type of theme that helps organize our thoughts of what's going on. So the dispositional theme is now working with that, in that realist tradition of saying, look, we're interested in causation. We're interested in what produces things, what needs to exist and to exert its kind of causal force on the world for these feelings that people have to actually take place. So this is much more on the side of the researcher doing this important work in analysis of theorizing. It's coming up with an explanation, coming up with this what's called reproductive thinking about what must exist or what plausibly could exist in order for these events to be produced in the world. So these things, we categorize these as dispositional themes. And again, you can start these sentences in a different way. So something like the inferred phenomena is dependent upon the existence of X. So just to help you clarify your thoughts, what exactly are you saying here? So through this way and through going through these steps, you're thinking about this surface level. You're saying concretely, like without really beyond reasonable doubt, you're having these experiential themes of what you really confidently say empirically from the study. And then you're moving out to a second layer of themes, which are inferences you can make based on these experiences. And then finally, these dispositional themes where you're theorizing about what might explain these things to exist. And then we have three categories of themes.
Fantastic, Gareth. Thank you so much for going through that, as you say, brief and very clear explanation of the three. And there's actually a metaphor that you use in the paper that I absolutely love to understand this thing, just like a flower, if you're seeing it from a helicopter view, of those experiential things being like the petals that you see in this flower, right? That the things that are clearly observable at that level. The inferential things being like the stem that you can't really see it because you're on top, but it's making everything stay up. And then the dispositional themes being like the roots and the soil that is making the flower to arrive. So that metaphor I really enjoyed, and I just wanted to share with listeners as well, because I think it really highlights all those three levels and three layers that you're trying to share. And that's one of the key differences that you mentioned, that the themes are within a realist philosophy of understanding of this ontological depth, i.e., what happens, what that experience is not the cause per se, it's a deeper cause, deeper power that is exerting that experience. From that explanation that you just provided, experiential and inferential dispositional themes, would you mind briefly just walking through an example of what that could look like in practice? Because I know, for example, in the paper you talk around sports coaching, and how participants were talking around that and their experiences of that. So, what would a experiential theme, inferential dispositional look like?
Yeah. So I guess in the paper I could we could kind of go through some of these examples in the paper, but I happen to be a sports coach myself, so I could even talk about my own experiences here nicely. So yeah, my main sport is athletics. I love athletics. Used to do it myself ever since sports day when you're in school and you find you can run relatively quickly and then go to a club, and then you do it in school, and then you get coached by people while you're doing it, and you meet lots of friends while you're doing it. And when you finish competing yourself, you have some other options. You can kind of leave the sport and do something else with your life. But lots of coaches, they take on a new role. Instead of competing themselves, they become coaches. And so that background is important, because if you're interested in these, coaches are often not paid. So these are volunteers. It's a sport that doesn't have much money. So the question of the research, one of the questions in the research example and in my own example is, well, why on earth do people coach? I spent a few hours last night coaching, and then we collected some videos, and I was analyzing them last night. And then this morning, even before work, I was analysing these videos. Why on earth am I doing this? Why? And I've got other things to do, surely. So the question in the interview might be like, why are you coaching? Because the sport needs volunteers, and in some sports clubs you can't find coaches anymore, and you're really the sport will die without these volunteers. But this can happen in a bunch of different domains. Whether you're thinking about charities, you think about volunteering for community events, mental health charities, a bunch of different domains. You get this idea of volunteers doing some extra work paid. So the question is, why are these people doing it? Okay, so if you imagine you have an interview with a coach and say, why on earth are you doing this? You then might reveal some things. So if someone was interviewing me about why I'd be a coach, I'd say, well, probably it's part of my identity. I probably feel like I'm a coach. So I could say that would probably be I feel happy when I'm coaching. I feel excited when my athletes do well. So these are all things that I can express confidently and would come across in an interview, and would appear in an interview transcript. So these would be the kind of the experiential themes. This is what I experienced. And think about concerns as well. So what would my concerns be? Well, I guess my concerns would be, if I didn't do sports coaching, would I have a hobby that's meaningful to me in my life? That I'd be concerned about a gap in my life, or a concern that I don't feel valued to other people, um, or these concerns that you have. The reason why you pick these hobbies. So you could list these things as experiential themes. Now, inferential themes would be, say, you're not going to look at the data again, but what you might do is look across a number of different coaches. So I've just told you about myself, but if we interviewed 10 other people, and we found that some younger coaches have some similarities, and some older coaches maybe felt a little bit differently, then we can start to see patterns emerging, and we can start to infer and start categorizing between participants. It might be that younger coaches still want to have still got that identity, or a yearning to kind of be part of that community, and they might want to seek success. Maybe they were failed athletes themselves. That would probably work for me as well. So it's nice to be part of people winning when you couldn't win yourself. But it might be that older coaches don't feel that anymore. They haven't got the same ego. They haven't got this. They're probably doing it for different reasons. So you're starting to make inferences not about what individual people expressed, but about what we can maybe say about a group of people. So this is more this inductive thinking, inductive reasoning that you can that you can start to use. But then you've also, in these inferential themes, you've also got this idea of this conceptual redescription. So you go from what's probably plain English, layperson language used in the experiential themes, to more conceptual themes. So I've already said something like identity. Identity might not come up in an interview. So people might say that, oh, I feel like I'm myself. I feel like it's a part of me. But then, so in the inferential themes, you can probably then start to put the word identity onto this idea. Or in the interviews, if they say something like, I like going down the track because I know people. I feel like my friends are there. It's nice to have a club, and I have like maybe a T-shirt with my club on it. So then that's what they're saying, and you can record that. But in the inferential themes, you as a researcher can say, "Oh, do we have a word for this?" And something might be like belonging, or a sense of community. So these things, you now have the license to start redescribing these things as part of the inferential themes. So you should then develop a list of inferential themes, and then the last stage on these dispositional themes, that's where you're starting to go why. So with that term artistic license, this is where you can have more of an art license, or it might seem that way, and it's probably going to be a little bit more debatable. However, really, they need to be just as scrutinized, and even more scrutinized, the further you move away from the data. So with the dispositional themes, you can start to say, okay, why? Why would someone feel like they need a sense of belonging? Does someone need to feel like they have an identity? And suddenly these things are actually more general across domains, and you can borrow from wider theory, grander theoretical ideas to explain probably deeper human dispositions that are either psychological or sociological. It could be about the economy, volunteering, a good example. You could ask people why they don't volunteer, and it could be economic reasons that they can explain because they haven't got the spare time, they're tired. You can come up with physiological reasons about how many hours we can work in a day. But this deeper need for identity and community, you might draw on some other theory, and that can come down in the dispositional themes. So, so that would be a nice example of essentially you're still answering the same research question of why on earth is Gareth spending his time coaching? why do people volunteer in this particular sport? But you're doing so in ways that move from the really concrete, empirical about each individual to making broad inferences about coaches in general, then to start proposing some theories about what it's like to be a person more generally.
Right. Thank you so much again for walking us through that. And by the way, if I was also coaching athletics at Loughborough, I would happily also volunteer through that.
Mm.
A fantastic place to be and to do athletics. But as you mentioned, all these different steps and ideas, what they're trying to do, and I guess that's one of the key differences again from this realist thematic analysis, is to get into this depth, into this ontology, this way of seeing the world that we spoke in episode 2 already of the realist lens, and what we're interested in realist work and realist research, which is the generative causal powers, forces that may be indeed impacting what we see at the other levels of the themes that we're speaking about. So that is really interesting that you go through that. As you were speaking, though, I do have a question because you mentioned that moving from experiential to inferential to dispositional things, you mentioned this freedom or license in order to go into a little bit deeper or a little bit more abstract into that process. How much is too much? So how much is, that you're not close enough to the data now, so now it's something else? Or I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Into when is it too much to go, and what is your process to keep you still grounded in the data without going into something that now it's completely different?
Yeah, excellent question. I guess I'm using those words, license and freedom to think. Well, it's starting to the work needs to be done by the researcher as opposed to just essentially trying to mirror or accurately represent what's on the page or what's said. However, you don't have freedom. Yeah, you can't say whatever. And the process that we went through, we are fully in support of using other people and as a as a way of reducing risk to validity is is our thinking based on our validity paper. We can't we can't know that our interpretations, our inferences, theories are valid, but we can reduce the risks. And obviously, sometimes these are personal biases, sometimes these are misreadings, sometimes you're reading into the data what you want to read into them. So having someone else to kind of check your thinking and to help justify what you're thinking is important. But so there's partly the conceptual tools. You can do it on your own, but we find it helpful to have someone else to kind of check your ideas. So the idea of validity was useful for us. So in the experiential themes, you've got this idea of descriptive validity, which actually happens. Sometimes you misremember or misread what someone said. For example, someone said they were inspired to be a coach because of their PE teacher, and one of us put down they were inspired because of the coaching they received, but actually it was the teaching. So slight difference, teacher and coach. So we clarified each other, and that's a quite easy disagreement to resolve. And then once you start inferring, I think if you're going to say that something like most men in our sample thought this, but most women thought this, that's a quantitative thing. As much as qualitative researchers kind of don't want to think that or don't want to align with numbers, you'll still see people in a qualitative paradigm, big Q qualitative paradigm, using words like most, all, some. That these are quantitative ideas, really, just without numbers on them. And we don't need to fetishize the precision you get. You don't need to say 57.5% of participants thought this. You don't need to pretend. But if you're gonna, you can still use words like most, all, some, a minority. But actually noticing that and presenting that transparency is also useful. So when you're having this discussion with a colleague or with yourself, if you're diligent enough, you can say, well, is it really most people who said this? Because you know there's actually only four of them, and only two of them said it. So can we now say just some, or maybe with 4 people, there's only 4 males in your sample, so we can't actually make a very strong claim about this. So it's really there's still with small sample sizes, I think you still need to have kind of a loose interpretation of what this means, but the idea is still there. The idea of, there's you need to question the validity of this statement when you're making inferences about what your group might say, or if you're going to start to infer from your sample to the wider population. But there's also this thing, it's not just about numbers, of course, there's also this thing that you get as a qualitative researcher, especially when you're conducting the interviews, of strength of feeling, which some people might express, really strongly. They might only say it once, but, by God, they meant it. It might be that one particular participant was just really insightful, and you felt they had a deeper reflexivity of their own ideas. So you're allowed to then say, well, actually, no, I think this is a stronger theme. I'm really confident that this is important to these people. So yeah, so these ideas come in there, but the other concept of validity, which is important, that we get from Maxwell, is this interpretive validity, which is where, the simple example is when 2 people are having a conversation and you're not 100% sure what they're saying to you. Especially imagine if you're in work and someone's trying to say something without using the words, and you have to kind of pick up on some cues. So do you really understand what they're trying to say? And that's really useful, like in an interview, if you can, speak back to the person and try and clarify and find some language that works for both of you, that is great. But often you can't do that when you're analyzing transcripts after the fact. So that's where you've got a little bit more of a difficult thing, where 2 of you might need to say, no, I think this is what they meant, because you're rewording their expressions. So you've got a responsibility then to say, oh, this is actually what they meant in that context. So again, this is a natural human thing, but as long as we're being rigorous and careful with that, I mean, this sounds loose, isn't it? But at the same time, it's pretty common sense, because we do this in high stakes things in our real life. If you are with a partner in a long-term relationship and you're not sure whether you want to stay together for a long time, you're going to need to have a conversation where you really know what each other's saying, and you don't need a scientific protocol for this. You're just going to have to try hard. Try hard to understand what the person is saying to you, and this is a good way of doing it. So if you seriously want to try and make sure you're interpreting what's going on, then I think you can do it intuitively. And then finally, the dispositional themes. This is ontological plausibility. This is much more what the philosophers do. This is the realm of, or even the realm of theoretical physicists, or in psychoanalytics, where you've got a particular theory that is debatable, but there's ways of having stronger theories that aren't necessarily, you can't necessarily adjudicate between them through doing experiments. You can adjudicate between theories through coherence. So theories also, I've talked about kind of grander theories, but you're probably not going to unpack whether something's sort of Freudian or whether something is from other psychologists. But what you can do is you can say, in this context for these people, does it make sense that Gareth coaches because his identity is important to him, or seeing people after work is important to him? Does this make sense? And you say, well, he also said other things that are coherent with that, but maybe he said other things as well. So you can come up with theories that are more or less plausible. And again, you can have this conversation with yourself, or you can have your conversation with someone else. And the process is ongoing. Even after you've published your thematic analysis, the process continues, because then other people can dispute the theory that you come up with. And overall, you do your best job within your study, but and that will go through scrutiny internally, and then through the peer review process, and then after it's published, it will go on further scrutiny as well. And maybe there's some other papers that come up with different theories that object to yours. So, but at least you're being clear of the reasons why you're choosing theory over others, and you're being transparent with the process that got you there. I think there is a concern. What the other thing I haven't mentioned, we didn't mention in the paper, but I've thought about since, is there is this idea in lots of research in the social sciences. I'm still not sure where I stand on it, but it's the idea of having a lens, particularly a theoretical lens, which is often framed at the start of papers and the start of analysis, or these types of analysis where you say, "I am doing a such and such analysis on this transcript." And for me, that's kind of come to your conclusions from the start, and you're inevitably going to see the things that your theory wants you to see. So I think that is an issue. Whereas within the analysis that we're proposing, we propose that the dispositional themes come towards the end. It doesn't entirely protect you from, imposing your theoretical lens later, but at least it's not kind of from the start, and you want to be transparent that it's of how you use that and why it made sense in this particular analysis. So yeah, so it's not complete freedom, and they need to be held to account, and you need to scrutinize each level of that interpretation. But I think that's what we need to do deeper, better analysis.
Fantastic. I think you share some really good nuggets there for people to really look into, because it can be quite daunting for some, as you say, to go into that more interpretative lens or going deeper into those mechanisms and getting that validity from different stakeholders, importance of vocabulary, choosing the right words, being transparent. The strength of feeling I found quite interesting as well. I think that it's true, particularly if you're doing the interviews yourself. I think that is something that can come across quite nicely as well. And then you've mentioned around the role of theories as well at the end. And that's something I want to touch on as well, because as you know, with realist evaluation and realist synthesis, one of the key roles of that is to start with theory and end with theory. So you have an initial program theory, and at the end, you'll have a refined program theory and explanation based on those initial hunches of what is going on. So, why is it that, some people volunteer for athletics and not others, for instance? Um, how does this form of realist thematic analysis that you and Nora have done um, align with that theory development? So with CMO building or other similar heuristics? Because you mentioned around, the experiential themes and people talking around their experiences. But say if someone was doing a realist interview from a Pawson and Teeley teacher-learner cycle kind of situation, where someone is, rather than asking around experiences per se, asking around refining, refuting, and confirming theories, how does this process of experiential, inferential, and dispositional themes align with theory refinement and testing?
Yeah, I think it aligns in attitude, but it's a different process. It's a really good question. One thing I would say as well is that with this method, we're really thinking about analyzing semi-structured interviews that have been conducted in a traditional semi-structured interview way, as opposed to this theory-driven interview idea where you're asking the participants to theorize and explain, and together you're coming up with something that makes sense. So in that way, it's different because it's not part of a broader whole methodology from start to finish. This is really on the analysis process. So that's the difference. I think it's something that's similar is that you're still looking for mechanisms. You're still the heuristic of a CMO essentially is replaced with the sentence structure that we suggest towards the end of the paper. You go through these. It's supposed to come up with experiential themes, inferential themes, and dispositional themes, and then we say, well, try and reverse the order of those, and that actually structures then a sentence, a long sentence, but it's a sentence where you can say, because of the existence of X, it's likely that coaches are going to feel Y, and in our data, this manifested in Z. Um, so in a way, that I see that as a similar heuristic to CMO, in that you're explicitly saying an outcome is the experience, really, the experiential theme. The mechanism is the disposition, so there's a similarity there. The context, I think, isn't explicitly part of the process that we've described, but it's kind of implied in there because there's going to be a point as part of my our conversation today. I've talked about if you wanted to split your sample up into, let's say, men or women, or younger coaches and older coaches, or whatever category you want, you could easily do that with the context. You could easily say interview participants in this context thought this, expressed this, and this is why, and interview participants in this context thought this and why. So you always have that the kind of like demographic or kind of situational circumstances as part of the notes you've got for each participant, and they'll hopefully talk about that in the interview as well. They'll give a little bit of a background of themselves. So you can easily integrate that context into the inferences that you make at that stage, and start splitting up your along the lines of those different contexts. So I can see a nice paper in there at some point if someone wants to do that, to explain how you could integrate them. But I think you would essentially bring it in at the inferential stage, looking at patterns and looking at how the contexts are part of that pattern.
Really interesting. Thanks, Gareth. And I completely agree with what you said around those explanatory statements at the end that you mentioned, that being really useful then to translate into a CMO, ICMO, or other heuristic. And that's what I found in my own work. That gives you like it's kind of like an if then because statement in a way as
Yes.
well, like more of a narrative to then probably put into that heuristic and way of thinking at the end. So that's really useful tips as well at the end. And I've really enjoyed our conversation and hearing you sharing your examples, your thoughts, your ideas, and the work that you have, Nora, put together, which again, I absolutely love. We always end these conversations with three tips and three practical tips for people who may be listening to this and maybe either considering realist thematic analysis in their work, or they may be starting designing their project and they're thinking around this kind of ideas. So for people who are looking at realist thematic analysis in the way that you and Nora put together, what would be the three top tips, practical tips of advice that you would give to them? They're going to leave the podcast, they're going to go and do their analysis, they're going to get started. What are the three things you would say?
Well, on the spot, there we go. That's difficult. I will say if you're primarily a qualitative researcher, and I would say don't be put off by the labeling realist. That would be my first thing. I think we're in this framework at the moment where qualitative researchers are kind of told that they have to find their camp to begin with, and then only do things that align with that. And I think that can be a bit of a problem. I mean, to be a little bit provocative, I'd say sometimes that's like asking a 10-year-old what their political party they prefer to align with. You don't really know, and you can be persuaded. So I think, yeah, unless you've got a really mature idea and you don't like realism, then I'd say just be open to it and just ignore that title and then see what you like from the content and try that. In terms of another tip, my second tip would be to be flexible with this method. The paper that is the clearest explanation that we've got at the moment is only a process, and it's only done on 2 interview transcripts. So we conclude the paper by saying that this might need to be tested out on a bigger sample. It's likely to generate a long list of themes and sentences, which is difficult to manage. This is a kind of intuitively, I like the idea, it makes sense, but you have to be humble and say this is a beta stage of a method, really. So bring your own things to it, bring your own ideas. If you want to integrate it with existing ideas you've got about analysis, then that's fine as well. I don't know whether this works as part of the third tip, but I'd say, you know, look out for some work we've got going on at the moment where we're trying to develop the use of AI with qualitative analysis. There's a project that we've got at the moment called Quail, and we're looking at people's attitudes to using AI in qualitative data analysis, and we are using this version of thematic analysis as a way of testing out whether it is useful, usable, whether you can trust it or not. My hunch at the moment is that it's going to be really useful, and we can also keep it human centered and put the tools in their place, as some people have said, and not let them. It's not going to be a click a button and let it do it for you, but it's going to kind of assist you to do it. So I'd say as a third tip, play around with the use of AI in doing this analysis, or wait, depending when people are listening to this, wait a few months or a year, and hopefully we can publish some guidance on how to use AI with this type of analysis as well.
Number one, don't be put off by realist label. Number two, have flexibility with the method. And number three, look at the recent developments that are happening with this kind of work in AI, your work coming up, and also, as you say, playing around with it. Gareth, it's been an absolute pleasure having you in. Thank you so much for your time, for your thoughts, and for yours and Nora's work as well, who I know couldn't make it to the podcast today. But also, Nora, if you're listening, thank you so much as well for all your help and developments in these ideas. And for everyone listening to the Realist Lens, thank you so much for your time for another episode, and I'll see you soon. Gareth, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.